first would be the South China Sea arbitration ruling from 2016 with regards to the nine dash line. What's your take on that? Because the Duterte administration kind of went along with China's demands, played it down. What do you think about this whole issue? Does it make sense to go legally against Chinese authorities, to challenge them? How did the Philippines play it?
Right. Well, to put that arbitral award into perspective, it was the Philippines. It's a compulsory or binding dispute settlement mechanism by the signatories, and China is a signatory. And it has provision if a party does not want to participate, the tribunal can continue, and a judge is appointed to represent that country. So it was China. So in 2016, what the Philippines did, one, in UNCLOS, the UN Convention on Law of the Sea, does not resolve sovereignty disputes nor disputes over delimitation, but it only acts to interpret and apply itself. So the Philippines' approach was to basically say, what are our entitlements? We're an archipelagic country with lots of islands and sea lanes. China's doing this, that, and the other, damaging the, et cetera, et cetera. What are our entitlements? And there are certain features out there. Could you tell us under the law, and this was the major thing, what are they? Are they rocks entitled to 12 nautical mile zone? Yes. Are they islands? Are they whatnot? And also that China's making historic claims. So among the many, many decisions that the Arbitral Tribunal made, and it was unanimous, was that the basis of China's claims to historic right had no foundation in international law. It had been superseded by UNCLOS, which China had signed and ratified itself. And that all the features that the Philippines had mentioned belonged to it. And none was an island. They were either rocks or low tide elevations. And low tide elevations can claim no maritime zone. Now, China has since constructed artificial islands. In the tribunal, you cannot change the nature of a feature by building on it. So your question, that when the decision came down, the Philippines' response was to issue a very brief statement that all parties should be sober-minded about applying it. Duterte came to power. I know he originally said during the campaign he'd get on a jet ski with a Philippine flag and go out and challenge. But in deference to China, he set it aside.
Yes.
But during his 6-year period of administration, he waffled back and forth. He set it aside in part because he doesn't like the United States, and even though it's a treaty ally, and thought he thought he could, with Russia or China, develop a counter alliance, which never eventuated. So at the end of his administration, though, Duterte spoke to the UN General Assembly and made statements indicating that they accepted it as the basis of law. Now, UNCLOS has no provisions for enforcement. So, and we're stuck with China. So that's just a fact of life. And so the Duterte left for Ferdinand Marcos Jr., the new president, that legacy. And he's kind of reaffirmed it, that they accept that judgment as part of international law, and not putting it aside, but not pressing it. But now, because of when I was talking about maritime militia, during the transition period, you had around Whitsun Reef several hundred Chinese fishing boats just squatting and occupying an area, or elsewhere in the archipelago, preventing fishermen from the Philippines returning to traditional fishing grounds because it was completely filled with Chinese fishermen itself. And the Philippines had started to lift a ban on joint oil exploration, and China wanted to get involved, but the Philippine Constitution puts restrictions on that. So a service contract would be acceptable because that would acknowledge Philippine sovereignty. So we're now into, we're talking about this legal settlement and the Philippine rights, but at a time of rising tensions between China and the United States. And the Philippines has yet, even though they're yet to, I think, really trust the US administration or be confident enough that the Manila, their mutual defense treaty would be invoked. And I'll just stand by saying it's word for word exactly the same, the one that Australia has. They were signed 2 months apart in 1951, but they only say the party should consult. And that's because only the US Congress can declare war. So you can't have it automatic, for example, in that. So there it is. It's case law for the world. In other words, anywhere else, the decision, the key there, which is Article 123, that made the distinction between a rock and an island and their entitlements much clearer than they had before. And the Philippines knows what is its, but in reality, on the ground, they're faced with Chinese Coast Guard vessels, they're faced with maritime militia and Chinese fishermen that intrude on their sovereign jurisdiction.
Okay, so one more question is with regard to the recent speech or meeting that the Chinese ambassador had in Australian National Press Club. What's your take on that?
Well, for your listeners, Australia and China are massively complementary economies. And over time, it built up a fantastic economic relationship, became comprehensive strategic partners. Australia has a massive trade surplus, selling iron ore. This is win-win. How do the two, with all these things working together, come to blows? And they did. The previous government was critical about China's handling of COVID,
yes,
restrictions on China, so that for 3 years, up to May, when we just had our elections, no minister in Australia could contact his Chinese counterpart. They didn't respond. And we were subject to Chinese press attacks on our leaders. Everyone's a stupid clone and puppet of the Americans. We only open our mouths and say what the Americans ask for. So really, and $20 billion was slapped on Australian exports and wine, barley, beef, etc. So things were bad. So China, previous ambassador, was a wolf warrior who enjoyed all this because he could get stuck into Australia. All of a sudden, we get Xiao Jian, a perfect diplomat, unflappable, perfect English, who comes to Australia and says the election of a Labor government provides an opportunity to reset. And at the Shangri-La dialogue, the two defense ministers met. But unfortunately, at a meeting in Geneva of trade ministers, China declined to meet our trade minister to deal with these restrictions. But then the Quad held its second summit that took a stronger anti-China. AUKUS, Australia, United Kingdom, US got together to provide Australia with nuclear-powered submarines. And Australia began to join the Biden administration in criticism. But nonetheless, we have a new government, Scott Morrison, and you recall he formed a government of taking various portfolios, and they ran off to that Quad summit within 24 hours to indicate. So the ambassador speaking at the National Press Club, and during the confrontation with the previous government, they listed China had come up with 14 grievances that were released in our press. And then there was then after the election, a document, and it's argued in Chinese, so the Chinese ambassador clarified, no, they're not demands, they're hopes. We hope you'll treat us with respect, this, that, and the other. So he got up there and spoke and said it was time for reset, detailed in much greater way than I've done the depth of the economic relationship, the tourist relationship, and we earn money from that. So the cutting off, and students, 131,000 Chinese students studying in Australia, and that brings big money, and our universities are dependent. And wouldn't it be nice if both sides could show respect? The Australian nasty press just mouths anti-bad Chinese things, if they could change their tune. All the two Chinese Australians who were imprisoned for espionage in China. Well, that's a part of Chinese law. Oh, the incidents involving your warships in the South China Sea, they were unfortunate, but nonetheless. So I was asked to appear on TV, and I opened it, said we had a silver-tongued diplomat offering an iron fist with a velvet glove. So we have him really appealing to those sections of Australia that have, under the previous government in particular, and during our election, saying, cool it. The anti-China rhetoric in Australia went hyperbolic. It just was excessive. And it was unseemly. And it hurt the feelings of the ethnic Australian Chinese community here, who began to feel if you were born in China, you are now seen as an agent of the Chinese Communist Party. Be like me being, because I was born in America, being seen as a CIA agent forever, trying to manipulate the government. So that's the context. It was tough. I mean, it was honey-coated, and it was delivered with aplomb. He didn't lose, but there were, in a sense, China is never going to resolve from wanting to reunify with Taiwan. And he even said, when asked when they did so, that Tsai Ing-wen may have to be re-educated to understand the proper, and that was taken in an Australian press that the entire Taiwanese population would be subject to re-education camps like the Uyghurs of it. I mean, that's on the extreme side. That, all possible means, quoting like almost American statements, and you can imagine what that would be. And China then issued at the same time a white paper on the Taiwan question.
Yes.
About that. So that China will not resolve. It's a matter. You've signed your one China policy in Australia. You signed a policy that said Taiwan is a province of China. You must respect that. This is a red line. China won't resolve. So it was a wolf warrior covered in sheep's clothing. He's not a wolf warrior, but in other words, the hard line from China, but delivered in such an elegant manner, soft-spoken, appealing to the common ground. And for your listeners, the position here has been for the government to tone down its anti-China rhetoric, criticize the ballistic missiles and that activity over, and say it's really China, if you lift the $20 billion tariffs and punitive economic actions against us, and perhaps free the two Chinese Australians from political charges, and China refutes that, saying it's just a legal matter, then we have a basis for moving forward. So and then the ambassadors' words every now and then are undercut by commentary in the Chinese press, criticizing the government whenever it responds to Chinese actions with a kind of criticism. So it's a way, in other words, it's going to be a long-term process. A reset's not going to happen immediately.
Yeah, but when he was then confronted with questions both in English and Chinese, there was actually no change. I mean, all his answers were either evasive or, same stuff like before, or blaming again the Australian media. So actually, in the end, there was nothing new, although he tried very hard to make it look like blame it on Australia, make, Australia should change and open again and adjust. But the questions that followed during the Q&A or his answers were actually nothing new. So it's the same thing again and again.
Right. That's what I meant when iron fist with the velvet.
Yes.
If you listen to him, he sounded so reasonable. He was clever enough, as you were saying, under the questions, never, use your own imagination. Well, the other guy the other previous ambassador could be quite pointed, poke you in your eye. And I think that's the consensus in this country now that I can see. When I ended that saying, relations aren't going to be reset tomorrow, that hope. You're not going to divide the Australian community but we're finished a hyperbolic past.
Okay.
Where the current defense minister during the election as opposition spokesman, Scott Morrison, he contacted the Chinese embassy more than my minister for foreign affairs. So they called him the Manchurian candidate. Well, probably because China wasn't receiving the Australian foreign minister back then. And the opposition minister was doing what he should be doing, learning about the foreign policies of all countries of the world, and China not least, because it's important. But I mean, that just goes to show you, I mean, it was, you know, we have a Cold War expression, kicking the commie can.
Yes.
You know, you pick it just to get a Reds under the bed. They're everywhere. And it was just unseemly because it you could get your message across with a more measured language, and it was used and it worked against the government. In other words, both mainland China and the Australian electorate said Scott Morrison couldn't be trusted. I think would be the bottom conclusion of that.
Okay, thank you very much for your time. It was really, really interesting. Thank you for your insights.